Now, at this point, you saw that we have uploaded some components with jar file and some other metadata file, etc. to Nexus repository. And this means that Nexus must have some kind of storage configured to store all these assets and components. So Nexus is using Blob stores as a storage for its components. And if I go back to the administration view with a list of items here, under the repositories, we have a Blob store. So Blob store is what Nexus is using to manage the storage per repository for all of its components. So how does this work? A Blob store is internal storage mechanism for binary parts of artifacts. And Blob store can be on a local file system, so on the server where Nexus is deployed. In this case, this is the DigitalOcean droplet. So the storage is configured on the droplet, or as an alternative, it could be a cloud-based storage like Amazon S3. Each Blob store can be used by one or multiple repositories and repository groups. And here, as you see, we have a default Blob store that gets created when we start Nexus, and this is configured as a storage for our repositories. And here you see some information about the Blob store, like how much space it has available, how much is already occupied, because we have uploaded some components. And if I click inside, you can see the path is set to default. And in this case, it is not possible to delete this Blob store because it is in use by the 7 repositories we have configured in Nexus. And as I said, you can create own Blob stores per repository, or you can share a Blob store among repositories. And if we go to the server where Nexus is running, in the /opt directory where we installed Nexus, we have the Sonatype work that we saw earlier, and /nexus3 folder inside. And here you see the configuration for Blob stores. So this is basically the file storage that keeps lots of different information about Nexus, like configuration and plugins, etc. And this is where also Blob store storage is configured. So all the components, assets, and so on will be stored here in the blobs directory. So let's actually switch into that directory. And in blobs, you see default folder, that's the name of the folder. And this represents actually the path that we have configured here, or that was automatically configured. So when you create a new blob, so to say, in the system, a new blob store, we define a path here, and that will be the directory in the blobs. So let's go into that path. And all the data is in the content folder. So if we go back to the blob stores, let's actually see the list view again. Here you see is a type, a blob store type. And for this one, which is configured on the local server where Nexus is running, is type file. So the type of a blob store is basically a blob store's storage backend. And file represents a file system based storage, which we just saw, like this. And another type that we have available for blob stores is S3, which allows blobs to be stored in AWS S3 cloud storage. And file type is the default blob store, which is actually the recommended one for most installations. And S3 type is only recommended for Nexus Repository Manager that is installed or deployed on AWS, in which case storing data in S3 is preferable. The second attribute is state. The state started indicates that it is running as expected. If it has a failed status, then it means there is a configuration error, some issue, and therefore the blob store failed to initialize. And here in the blob count, we see the number of blobs that are stored. If we look in the content folder, you see the data is actually split up in different volumes or blobs. And this is the number of blobs that is currently stored. So the components and the artifact files, etc. that we upload are split into this way to be stored in the blob store. Then we also have a size of all the blobs that are currently stored in the blob store. And at the end, we have the available space in the store, which is the overall space allocated to a blob store. So if we wanted to create a new blob store, the type can be file or S3. In this case, we're going to have file type. Name, let's call it my store. And the path parameter should be an absolute path to the desired file system location. And also, it has to be fully accessible by the operating system user account that is running Nexus Repository Manager. In our case, this is the Nexus user, which we created in order to start Nexus Repository Manager with it. And this path here, whatever it is, must be accessible to Nexus user. So it must have permissions to update and do stuff with it. And here you see the path is what we saw on the server /opt/sonatypework/nexus3. This is the path. Inside we have blobs like this. And right now we just have default path. And with this one, we can create a new path, which will be called my store. Also note that once a blob store has been created, it can no longer be modified, and any blob store used by a repository or repository group cannot be deleted. Now, there's some things that you need to consider when creating blob stores and configuring them, meaning attaching them to repository. First, you need to decide carefully how many blob stores you create, with which sizes, and which ones you will use for which repositories. So you need to know approximately how much space each repository will need. So if you have a Maven repository for your Java files, you need to decide, okay, how many jar files am I going to be storing there? How often am I going to push, and what are my cleanup policies? So how many will I have at maximum and at minimum? And when you calculate this, then you can decide approximately which blob store you assign to this repository, which size it will have, and so on. And the reason for that is because once a repository is allocated to a blob store, it is there permanently. Blob stores can be moved from one storage device to another. For example, to a larger storage device, if you need more space, you can do it manually, but blob stores cannot be split. And also, one repository cannot use multiple blob stores. It's just tied to one. And this is how it works for now. So the current state, you need to be carefully measuring and deciding all this information. So let's actually just create this blob store. And here we have a second one, which was also allocated the same amount of available space. And if I do ls blobs, here you see another blob store got created with my store as a directory name. And for now, that my store just has these same metadata, etc. files. And in the content folder, it's empty because it is not assigned to any repository, so it doesn't have any components and assets to store. And the way to assign this blob store to a repository is when you create a repository, let's say Docker hosted, in the storage part, you can actually select from the available blob stores, right? And this way you can attach a blob store to a repository. Now, if you go back to the existing repositories, this got changes. For example, snapshots, and in storage section, you see the default blob store, which is attached to it, and we cannot change it. So as I said, once you create a repository and choose a blob store, which in this case was done automatically by default, then that connection is permanent and you cannot change the blob store anymore. So we're going to use the newly created blob store when we create a new repository.